Our next speaker, Alex Cowan, started RazorSecure after 15 years in the gaming industry, working on massive multiplayer games with hundreds of thousands of players and thousands of servers. During that time, he'd worked in developing software to manage credit card payments and live operational systems, as well as dealing with hackers trying to gain an advantage over other players. His presentation will therefore cover cybersecurity in transport, protection on the move.
So I'm sure there's a bit of a question there, how gaming links to transport. I'll run through some of my slides and try and link it back to some of that. So in terms of RazorSecure and what we do, we provide intrusion and anomaly detection software, particularly focused on transport at the moment, but actually our software has much broader applicability than that. We're using machine learning in order to be able to detect anomalies, to detect deviations in systems, and then be able to identify cybersecurity issues as a result. We're already deploying this with rail companies, we're deploying it in aviation, and we very much see a future with self-driving cars protecting essentially what is the brain of the car. So to give you the introduction to RazorSecure, we're a British privately held company. We were founded just over 3 years ago, early 2015. We've taken investment from the UK government through the local LEP, and also Breed Reply, who I think are speaking a little bit later. And we're a global company, so UK headquartered, but we have developers in the US and also in Spain as well. And we work with global partners in aviation and rail. We were recently part of the GCHQ Cyber Accelerator, and I'll also go into some of the reasons that GCHQ was so interested in what we do and some of the new cybersecurity regulations that are coming. So actually, the way I've set up the slides today, it's essentially a presentation that I did a few weeks ago at the Airline Passenger Experience Conference. It's designed to give us a bit of a kind of grounding in cybersecurity, and then we go a bit deeper into RazorSecure, what we do, and particularly how we're using machine learning. So as the most brief introduction to cybersecurity, fundamentally what happens is we typically come back to this CIA triad. So that is essentially step one in cybersecurity. And what it says is essentially in order for a system to be secure, you have to take into account the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of the system. So fundamentally, if you lose any one of these three, it's likely that you're having a cybersecurity issue. And most frameworks follow this standard. So broadly, if you have a loss of confidentiality, it means you're leaking data in some way, maybe your encryption's been broken. If you have a loss of integrity, it could be the breach of a system, it could be the system's misconfigured in some way, or if you have a loss of availability, it's typically downtime or a lack of ability to be able to recover from downtime. So to give you some examples there, British Airways, I think it was last year, they had a loss of availability when their hosting center went down, and as a result, they weren't able to process passengers and get flights out from Heathrow. Loss of confidentiality, so last week you had Currys PC World, they lost user accounts, so they had a loss of confidentiality. Typically, the more of these that you lose, the worse the breach is. So if you look at Sony Pictures, for example, their network was compromised, a lot of the systems on the network were compromised. Actually, as a result, they lost confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and it essentially took them back to the Stone Age in terms of business processes. So they had to go back to paper, writing checks, and it shut down the business for actually more than a week. In terms of cybersecurity frameworks and legislation, so again, as a company, we're particularly focused on critical infrastructure. So the US has a cybersecurity framework. It's developed by NIST, their National Institute for Standards and Technology. And broadly, the steps that they go through is they say, identify the risks, protect the system. So protection is fundamentally about building walls. So that could be encryption, it could be network segregation, it could be firewalls. It's a very traditional approach to cybersecurity. And then they say you should be able to detect cybersecurity incidents, both known and unknown, be able to respond to those, so have planning in place, and then be able to recover from those. In the EU, we have a new cybersecurity directive. It was law actually in the UK from May the 9th, and also in the other 28 member states. And fundamentally, they legislated what good looks like for cybersecurity. And this NIST directive actually applies to oil, gas, water, energy, road, rail, aviation, so anything that could be defined as critical infrastructure. They have 4 key focus areas, so actually it's much broader than the US version, but fundamentally that's around how you manage your organization, which is a pretty standard ISO 27001 approach, how you run your processes internally, security monitoring and detection, and particularly anomaly detection, so they also have this focus on being able to detect unknown attacks, and then response and recovery. There are various requirements in ARINC standards and other standards for aviation and rail. As I mentioned, this was an aviation presentation. Fundamentally, there's a bit of a problem with all of these legislation, particularly when you look at transport, particularly when you look at global industries. They actually don't agree in some cases. So actually what you have to do is look at where's the commonality between between the legislation. What we've also seen is that the legislation is actually moving faster than standards, particularly in these industries, and these industries love standards. So fundamentally, everyone kind of defaults back to, well, we'll just be secure by design, right? But it's not really that easy. Secure by design means that you actually have to go back, design the system from scratch, and you can't normally do that in a transport environment, in other environments where you have legacy systems. So what we recommend is that you look for the commonalities between these frameworks, and then try and plug the gaps in the standards, and really focus on this layered approach. So quite often when you talk about cybersecurity, you hear about this layered approach. Fundamentally, what that means is at the very outer layer, you have intelligence. So that's threat modeling. How am I going to be attacked? What are my risks? How can I monitor for data leakage? How can I monitor for people that are going to try and attack me in some way? Then you get to the perimeter, and the perimeter is fundamentally firewalls, network segregation, and so on. The network itself, that's actually your internal network, and how can you protect that? And actually, I have a few technologies on the next slide that actually can help protect on the network layer. Then you start getting into the application. So this could be a website, for example. You get down to the host level, so that's an individual server, so how might that be attacked? And then finally you've got the hardware and how that might be attacked. So this is fundamentally what you need to take into account when you have this layered approach. Modern security, what they've said is you need to really go further than the traditional firewalls, encryption, network segregation, and so on. You need to be able to detect attacks and unknown attacks. So unknown attacks is anomaly detection. When you look at intrusion detection, there are typically 2 technologies, and that makes it a little bit confusing. So network IDS, or often just referred to as IDS, is technologies like Darktrace, Snort, Juniper, Cisco, lots of those other companies. They also make intrusion detection systems. Essentially, the way that you manage those, you mirror all of the traffic on the network to that box on your network. And then it looks for signatures based on known attacks, or in some cases unknown attacks like Darktrace. The upside it has is obviously no integration, because essentially you're just changing your network configuration, you're adding a box. But that's also a downside, particularly when you look at certain industries. So adding a box to every train, for example, it's not realistic. They can't afford to spend £50,000 on a Darktrace box for every train. It quite often has high false positive rates because of this focus on signatures. It misidentifies traffic. The other problem that this technology has is as encryption becomes more prevalent, as network traffic increases, then actually you need more powerful boxes in order to be able to handle that traffic. So it's essentially a technology that has a limit. What we're focused on is more host-based intrusion detection. So we focus on individual systems, and there are other technologies out there that do that as well. So there's RazorSecure, which is an open source product. There's Tripwire. Then there's us. Essentially, what we do is we monitor individual hosts. And where we do it differently to some of the others, they're very much focused on you have to configure their software. You have to define what to monitor and what normal looks like in some way. The problem is that drifts over time. So if you have a system that changes a lot, it can create other problems. The upside of host IDS is we can detect physical attacks as well. So in a transport environment, in rail, for example, everything in a train is behind essentially a square key. You can open it with a flathead screwdriver. We can also detect attacks that happen using non-standard methods. So we get also some additional monitoring benefits as well. So we're able to provide extra value to our customers over pure cybersecurity. The downside is it requires an integration, but In Rail, that means that we save having to have a box. If essentially we're protecting a box that's already deployed. And as I mentioned, some of the other ones can be quite difficult to configure. So when we talk about anomaly detection, so this is detection of unknown attacks, it's kind of like a doctor. The way a doctor manages a patient is they work from established baselines. So they will do a blood test or a urine sample, and they will then compare that to, this is what we know a person should look like. What we can actually do in terms of cybersecurity is we can do this almost on a level of personalized medicine. So we can define, this is what normal looks like for this one individual system. And what that means is then we can detect anomalies and deviations from that, and they are typically cybersecurity incidents. In transport, we get an additional benefit, which is actually you get the same systems that are replicated tens, hundreds and thousands of times. We describe those internally as small-scale networks, and actually in critical infrastructure, you see those all over the place. So they're in communications, they're in smart cities. Manufacturing is another good example where you get these same systems that are replicated again and again. One of the big problems with a pure signature-based approach, particularly when you're looking at aircraft, it's too focused on the past. So attacks change over time. And this is why there's this focus on also being able to detect unknown attacks. So when you're focused on the past and trying to essentially second guess the attacker based on what you've seen them do before, it means that over time, in 5 years' time, you haven't necessarily had the opportunity to update the signatures, so you then have this big gap in your knowledge. What we do instead is we focus very much on the present and the future, and we do that with our machine learning. Essentially, we're using the best possible information we have about how this system works, because that's what we have in our control. We don't know what the attacker's necessarily going to do, but we do know how this one system will work. Fundamentally, intrusion anomaly detection software, our software understands what's normal, and we identify the attacks using the abnormal behavior. And I have a bit of a worked example in some of my next slides. Another key for transport is being able to do this even in a disconnected environment. So we don't necessarily have a guaranteed connection to the cloud. It may be a system that has intermittent connectivity. It may be a system that has no connectivity. So we need to be able to train our models in advance or be able to train models that can make decisions on their own. Essentially, the way we manage that ourselves is we define a playbook with the end customer to say, in the event of this type of attack, this is how it should respond. Or if it's a safety critical system, essentially we run in a detection only mode, so we can alert them to a cybersecurity attack, essentially get the information off the device we're protecting, and then they can pick it up from a connected system later on. Our machine learning approach, essentially we have two sides to our machine learning. We have what we call our deterministic. So this is essentially a very smart whitelist of this is what we know this system does. This setup is actually one of the reasons that GCHQ was so interested in us. They've very much focused on a probabilistic approach. So this is recurrent neural networks in our case. But this is the more traditional machine learning. In our case, we run that unsupervised. And essentially what we do is we train our models for what does normal look like? So how do we define what healthy looks like? What we can actually do once we understand that, and this takes around 3 weeks to train of running a system, we can actually train the deterministic in about 15 minutes. It's pretty quick in comparison. We also have this technology that we call the power of grouping. So I mentioned that in transport you have the same systems that are replicated tens, hundreds, thousands of times. What this means is actually when we treat systems as individuals, and when you have these systems that are replicated, you can compare across large groups of similar systems. So we can compare across, say, 100 trains, and we've got one that's different from all of the rest. So that could be the system's been misconfigured. It could be it's already been compromised. For some reason, it's different to the rest. And actually, this helps us deal with if a system's already compromised before our software is even installed, we can use the power of grouping to be able to identify that system essentially from the rest. What we typically talk about with our customers is the cyber kill chain. So Lockheed Martin came up with this about 15 years ago. Essentially what they said is in order for a cyber attack to be successful, it has to go through these 3 key phases, preparation, intrusion, and then the active attack. What they also said is that in order for this process to go through, it typically takes weeks and months from the beginning until the actual attack happens. So the attack happens here. All of this time is just building up to the attack. So essentially, if you can stop the attack at any point in this kill chain, you've stopped it. That's it. It's done. One of the big problems is if you only have passive protection, if you focused on firewalls, encryption, and so on, you typically lose that protection as you move from the preparation into the intrusion phase. So to give you an example attack, so this is how you would typically go through, hijack a system and establish a beachhead on a network. So you'd start off with a port scan, and that's in the preparation phase as an attacker. So this is understanding what systems are there, how you might be able to attack the services on an individual host. So say, for example, you have a web server is running code. So you might want to try and hijack that web server. So fundamentally, we would pick up a port scan using our network monitoring. If you're trying to hijack a process, that then means new network connections, and it means a different behavior, because you're trying to use that process to then get access to the system in some way. So this is where our probabilistic process health model actually helps us, because we can identify this process is now acting out of normal. The next step would be to create some kind of reverse shell. So essentially, this is giving the hacker access to a system to be able to call back in. So at that point, they've had to get access to the system. They've had to run some commands. They've maybe downloaded a script. They might have installed that script on something like cron or startup. So even if the system gets restarted, they still have access back in. We detect this using our deterministic cron monitor, also our process monitor. And then as you move into the last stage, this is typically privilege escalation. So this could be getting root access, admin access on the system, or it could be looking to make a lateral move in the network to then manage to escalate to admin. So you would typically go through that process by scanning the system for local vulnerabilities, running commands as root, and then at that point your beachhead's established. We can detect this using our probabilistic system health, our process monitor, our network monitor, power of grouping, and more. So essentially, as we go through this kill chain, we get more tools, we get better detection because there's more going on, but we can actually detect them right from the start. One of the challenges with a pure network approach is you can pick up the port scan. Port scan, they haven't actually done anything yet. You can potentially pick them up here, but you don't get anywhere near the detail on what's going on and actually be able to pick it up again and again and again, and you lose a lot of those opportunities. So attacks get missed as a result. We've had this live with Ariva Northern actually for since November last year. We went from a proof of concept to an initial 16 trains with them. We're now working on a fleet rollout. During the 16 trains, we picked up more than 30 attacks on board, so that's a mixture of denial of service. We picked up some system misconfiguration. We picked up a couple of cases where actually a system supplier was logging into the train and doing testing on board. The system supplier didn't actually know one of their developers was doing this, but we were able to pick it up, identify it, and we stopped it. So we're also working with other companies. So we've recently secured a contract with Siemens. We're launching this as a joint service with them at InnoTrans, so it's the biggest rail conference in the world. It's in September. And we're starting to make progress with a lot of these other providers as well. So the next generation of Bombardier trains expect to see our software on board protecting the systems. Our target for the next 5 years is to secure all connected infrastructure. As I mentioned, we were part of the GCHQ accelerator working with Wyra. So yeah, happy to answer any questions.
Cybersecurity is different in IT because it's actually a human, and it kind of evolves, and there's an attacker kind of constantly trying to evolve the threat.
Yep.
How much do the hackers use AI themselves to because they've got large amounts of resources now. They're very professional in what they do. So you're facing, as you have an AI solution, they must have an AI tool as well.
It's a really good question. At the moment, the bar is so low in cybersecurity in some cases that they just don't need to. They haven't needed to develop those tools yet. One of the big problems is we as defenders, we have to win every time. They only have to win once. And so we have to be ahead of them all of the time. Essentially, I think the future is it's coming, and there is a lot of research around GANs, generated adversarial networks, but the reality is they're not there yet. They're using a lot of scanning software in terms of being able to identify systems on the internet that are potentially vulnerable, but yeah, they haven't really got to that point yet, I would say.
The GDPR regulations, which came in May, how effective have they been so far in encouraging companies to, get up to standard with all of this? I mean, you would think that everyone would be there now, but I'm sure that's not the case.
No, it's definitely not the case. So GDPR, I would say it's had a big impact on email marketing. I think we all got flooded with we're changing our privacy policy before they implemented it. The reality is they're still not doing enough. So one of the lines in GDPR actually says that you should protect your data and take into account cost and the state of the art of cybersecurity technology. Fundamentally, there is always a cost-benefit analysis to be done, but most companies are at a point where they don't understand cyber well enough to be able to make a good decision about what they should be deploying. Overall, as an industry, we have a shortage of about 1.5 million professionals globally. It's still very much not up to standard, and particularly when you start looking at critical infrastructure, the bar on cybersecurity is pretty low right now.
So on a scale of, let's say, 1 to 10, where do you think most businesses are? And secondly, who's going to be the big... I think what will happen is there'll be... some company will be made an example of and given a big fine, and it'll shake up the industry. Who's that likely to be, do you think?
Well, there's a really obvious answer to that one. So I would say it very much depends on the industry. So when you look at banks, it's probably a 8, 9. When you look at transport companies, they're pretty firmly in the 1, 2 category. And that's partly because they've come to it from different perspectives. So in banking, security is absolutely critical. In transport, actually, all the focus has been on safety. So they actually have some compromises to security as a result of their focus on safety, because rail, for example, the entire rail industry is designed on fail, stop. So stop the train, it's not a problem anymore. But the reality is that creates a denial of service attack in cybersecurity. You obviously can't stop an aircraft for other reasons. In terms of GDPR and who's going to be first, my guess would probably be Facebook, based on what's happened recently. But I do think they will make an example of someone. But whether it's someone big or someone small, I'm not sure.
Can I just ask about the types of attack that happen in kind of transport networks and Internet of Things, because we're much more aware of classic enterprise attacks, but I'm interested in you talked about denial of service, but I think you're talking about them stopping the train rather than a DDoS style attack. But I'd be interested in the is this ransomware type or a ransom attack? I'm interested in the types of threat.
It depends very much on who the attacker is. So if you're looking in terms of the opportunistic attacker, then typically it is ransomware. We've already seen at least 3 or 4 cases of that in transport. So San Francisco's BART system was hit. They had a massive ticket outage. Deutsche Bahn last year, when WannaCry happened, it was actually on all of their passenger information screens in one of the train terminals with the ransomware pop-up. The reality is transport is a big target for state actors as well. So I think it was GCHQ or NCSC that put out earlier this year that essentially said Russia has compromised a lot of our critical infrastructure systems. They're not doing anything at the moment, they're just watching. One of the problems they have is they don't know which ones. So actually being able to identify those, fundamentally when you look at it, you have to consider that someone like that, they are looking at potentially taking control in some way or being able to shut down those systems. So it depends very much on what your attacker looks like. If it's just an opportunistic passenger sitting on board, maybe they'll log in, have a look around. There might be a few articles posted in the news, dragged through the media, but they're probably not going to do anything particularly bad. So, yeah.
Hi. Rolls-Royce, remote diagnostic of engines. Is it possible to hijack one of those engine remote diagnostic systems to stall an engines and bring a plane down?
So they have a bit of an advantage.
I'm not asking because I'm looking to do it.
No. So they have a bit of an advantage in that they manage their own connectivity. In aviation, normally you only have that connection when you're on the ground. It does obviously have a connection back to them. They are pushing data back. There is a risk that in some way their firmware gets compromised when they deploy new updates and so on. That's already happened in cases, I think it was Juniper or Cisco, that they actually had someone that managed to inject something into their firmware and it was just missed as part of an update process. I think in aviation, certainly it's difficult enough to be able to deploy new firmware that it's probably not going to happen. I think Boeing said last year they had a vulnerability on their planes that they weren't fixing because it cost them $1 million per line of code that they deploy actually as firmware on the aircraft. So they actually are in a pretty good state in that they control both ends of the connection. It's when you start looking at other systems where actually they're running out through a common communications gateway like SATCOM, where you're in flight and you have cockpit connectivity and the cabin connectivity actually out through the same modem. So those are the higher risk systems in my mind at least.
Thank you, Alex.
Okay, thank you.